question with yourself, Nick. The second question says, how does, and I think it does come from an agent, just to confirm, how does one go about when a landlord gave permission to do repairs on a property and refuses to pay for it afterwards? The tenant or the tenants vacated, and it could not be deducted from the rental income. Is the agent allowed to invoice the landlord via PayProp and submit the report to TPN and have the DNP reflect on the land, or that did not pay reflect on the landlord's payment profile? Nick?
Okay, so let's just deal with the repairs to start off with. Okay, so obviously people are very familiar with the process of deposits when it comes to rental agreements, and the idea behind a deposit is you keep some money in security for any repairs or things that happen after the lease agreement has come to an end. Okay, and that money, while it is being held, it's very important to understand it is not the landlord's money. It is the tenant's money that is being held in security, but it belongs to the tenant at all particular times, and the intention is to use it. Okay, now where we started with this question is the writer says, well, the landlord has now given permission for certain repairs to occur on the property, okay, but now doesn't want to pay. So what I'm assuming happens, and we do get landlords who do this, is they want something fixed on the property after the tenant vacates, but they don't want to pay for it because they say, well, the tenant is ultimately liable for the repairs. Now, while that might be correct, okay, depending on whether this is, damages that have been occasioned by the tenant while they're in occupation of the property, okay, and not just fair wear and tear, that contract that the landlord enters into with the contractor to do the repairs, that is an agreement that is created between the landlord and the contractor themselves. Okay, that only those two have entered into that particular agreement. So what we find sometimes is landlords go, well, I've entered into this particular contract with the contractor, but I'm not going to pay the contractor because the tenant is supposed to. And unfortunately, that's not how contract law works. The contract is entered into between the landlord and the contractor. The landlord is responsible to the contractor to fulfill his obligations, which in this case is payment. Okay. The deposit is a special thing in law, which the landlord is entitled to take money out of to cover the costs that he suffered as a result of using that particular contractor. Okay, so it's a special allowance that the landlord can tap into to pay for these costs. Okay, again, it doesn't mean that that money is his. Okay, it is still the tenant's money, and if, say, the repairs don't use the entire amount that's held for in a deposit, the landlord is obligated to refund that amount back to the tenant in the circumstances. Okay, but ultimately the landlord is still responsible to the contractor, so he can't refuse to pay. Okay, and the contractor would, in law, have the ability to, say, for instance, approach a court to get their money paid to them. All right, so on that point, you can't refuse. The landlord is actually the one who's entitled to then, if this is damage caused by the tenants in their occupation of the premises, they can now take action against the tenants because they've suffered a damage for which they needed a contractor to actually do some remedies on the premises. Okay, and they've obviously the question says it couldn't be deducted from their rental income. Generally, you'd want this to be deducted from a deposit because that's what the deposit is intended for. But in the absence of a deposit or a sufficient deposit, you would then demand performance from the tenants and say, I've suffered a damage, this is what you're liable for in the circumstances. As for the last part of the question, loading this as a payment onto TPN, and doing a DNP, so that a DNP is did not pay. There might be an ability for you to do it. So you basically do an invoice that says this is the amount that's outstanding, and then the invoice gets sent off to the tenants, and you see whether the tenants pay or not, and if they don't, you do a DNP. To be very honest with you, I'm not 100% sure on the TPN system whether it will allow you to do that, because it might lock out at the end of the lease period, and I'm assuming that that's happened, seeing as the tenants have already vacated the premises. So I'm not 100% sure on that particular side, but as for the liability perspective, the landlord's not going to be able to escape liability from the contractor and decide not to pay the contractor because they believe that the tenant is liable for those particular damages. The tenant might well be liable, but the responsibility sits in the hands of the landlord to collect that from the tenants for not paying, either by approaching a court or whatever other method that they want to do. The contractor has to be paid by the landlord because the relationship that exists with the contractor is only with the landlord, not with the tenants.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you very much, Nick, for that answer. And those are our 2 questions and answers for today, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us once again, and we'll see you next week Wednesday at the same time. Thank you again.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.